Welcome to A Case for America, a podcast where we talk about the laws, morality, different points of society that have to do with what makes America the place that it is. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and we both have slightly different backgrounds. I'm an attorney. Michael is into numbers, databases, software, and we like to look at how these two pieces come together, along with something that all of us are impacted by, which is just a sense of morality in society. The way that we look at America, law, and the Constitution come from what we like to refer to as the balance. In this episode, we will talk about the balance more. So if you can see it, it's up on the screen. But if not, if you're just listening, the balance has anarchy on the left side, tyranny on the right side. Anarchy is a state of no law. Tyranny is a state where law tells us everything. And the state of liberty is somewhere in the middle, where there's enough law to pull us out of anarchy, but there's enough freedom, morality, private solutions to keep us from tyranny. And so as we look at things today with the Ninth Amendment, we are going to see that the Ninth Amendment is weighted heavily in the morality side. It's talking about some of the things that exist that we as individuals need to do to keep either the balance in place or things that the law might need to respect to keep the balance in place as well. So keep this balance in mind as we go through this episode, because traditionally some of the things like the Eighth Amendment that we talked about last time were heavy on the left side of the balance. The Ninth Amendment then swings to the right side of the balance. But to go through the Ninth Amendment and what it means, the text of it says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So this is this amendment, if you read about it, the historical commentators have a slightly different view than some of the judges on what this amendment means. But even if you go to places such as congress.gov, constitution.congress.gov, they talk about how historically one of the main arguments against including a Bill of Rights is that if you said certain rights but you forgot one, that the courts would then say, oh no, that doesn't exist because it wasn't mentioned here. And so the historical commentators talk about how the Ninth Amendment was meant to tell the government, just because we didn't mention something doesn't mean that the people don't have those rights. So we mentioned freedom of speech and we mentioned freedom of religion, but maybe there's something we forgot that gets, that should have been mentioned here. And so it specifically talks about you can't deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. And that then begs the question, well, what rights are retained by the people? And one of the things to understand about the Ninth Amendment when we look at that balance, there has not been a case in U.S. history that found a right that existed under the Ninth Amendment as the sole basis for what it found. There's been a handful of cases where some justices talked about it, but it was usually in a concurring opinion or a dissenting opinion. And so there is some support, some argument to say that maybe the Ninth Amendment applies, but it's not one that has been ever held as the sole basis for court's decision. And so there are, as an attorney, I have a number of clients contact me. They get upset about a lot of things. People get frustrated by laws that take place and things that happen. It's a common question. Well, isn't that unconstitutional? That seems wrong. And inherently in people, even people that haven't read the Constitution, they'll still say that's unconstitutional. That's my right. Because there's something being infringed on that they feel is a core, either a core value or a core right associated with who they are. And they then argue for a right to be found or a right to exist. And so in that realm, I find that people often discredit judges and discredit constitutional interpretation by saying, oh, these judges are horrible, they're super liberal, they're finding rights that aren't even mentioned in the Constitution. And they're saying no judge should be writing a right into a law that wasn't expressly mentioned. We hear that often with abortion. We say abortion was never mentioned in the Constitution, and so they can't find a right to abortion. But the problem with that, at least that I see, is that that claim effectively eliminates the Ninth Amendment from constitutional existence. The Ninth Amendment says there are rights we didn't mention. And if there's rights we didn't mention, then are we really that upset at courts for finding a right that exists that was not mentioned? And in effect, are they giving some effect to the Ninth Amendment by recognizing that certain rights exist? Now, in listening to this, don't take it as me supporting abortion or some of the rights that I've found. I personally am opposed to abortion as a right generally. I do believe that, just to disclose my bias, there are some situations that a mother should be able to make a decision, such as if her life's in jeopardy. But I don't believe in general that from a moral perspective, abortion should be a right. But I don't feel I can criticize the courts for finding the existence of a right that's not mentioned, because the Ninth Amendment specifically holds and states that there are rights retained by the people. And if rights are retained by the people, how do we enforce those? How do we find those if we always have to go back to something that's written in the Constitution? And I think that is one of the troubling aspects of the Ninth Amendment. And it's one reason that justices have been very, very opposed to relying on the Ninth Amendment, because in their view, it kind of opens up a Pandora's box of, well, who knows what? We might find people of all different kinds of things they believe in as to what rights may or may not exist. And Michael, what are examples of some rights that people in society talk about right now or claim should exist or courts should find exist?
Yeah, there's a long list outside of what you might read in the Constitution. You hear a lot about, in general, people talking about rights to healthcare, rights to education. I've heard about rights to work, rights to housing. I've heard about rights for animals, rights for plants to some degree. Recently, last couple of years, we had the situation with COVID-19 and different governments and people doing different things there. But lots of people felt they had a right to maybe not be sick. Some people felt they had rights to hospitals that didn't overflow. I've heard people talk about rights to a minimum standard of living. It's a human right. I was reading one article about a list of rights that they wanted to propose, and it got into what they called communal rights. They felt they had a community right to peace, a community right to a healthy environment, to a right to communication. There's a lot of rights, they call them rights generally, listed, that people think exist that should be protected by law. Pretty long list.
Yeah, and it is certainly interesting to see some of what people argue for. And I think one of the reasons people argue for it is because they encounter situations where it wasn't there for them, and they feel a loss of something personal or something important. So, for example, I'm sure it's a very discouraging situation to be sick and go to a hospital and get turned away because it's full. I'm sure it's terrifying if you feel like you have a life-threatening illness or disease. And during COVID, there were people who were terrified of getting sick and dying. And many of those at least from what I saw, many of those that were more afraid would argue more for a right to be free from illness. And many of them, if they were Constitution readers, would say, yeah, the Ninth Amendment, this right exists. We need to go read it in. And so these justices, though, in hearing a few of the cases that have come up, there haven't been a lot of cases that talk about the Ninth Amendment. And one reason for that is that the Ninth Amendment hasn't been heavily relied on by the courts at all. It's been mainly pushed this side. And so, for example, Justice Stewart wrote that the Ninth Amendment, like its companion, the 10th, was framed by James Madison and adopted by the states simply to make clear that the adoption of the Bill of Rights did not alter the plan that the federal government was to be a government of express and limited powers, and that all rights and powers not delegated to it were retained by the people and the individual states. Until today, and so he's dissenting, and we'll read a little bit about who he's dissenting from, but he says, until today, no member of this court has ever suggested that the Ninth Amendment meant anything else. And the idea that a federal court could ever use the Ninth Amendment to annul a law passed by the elected representatives of the people would have caused James Madison no little wonder. So he was opposed to it. He's going, look, as judges, we don't have this ability because he says all it was is just confirming that the government has to draw its power from what's listed in the Constitution. But he says it didn't give us the power to overturn these state laws. Now, the interesting thing about this is we haven't talked about it extensively in this podcast series yet, but we have another video on our website talking about Marbury versus Madison. But Marbury versus Madison was where the judiciary took on the role of constitutional review. And it's interesting here for judges to come back and say, whoa, actually, we don't have full power of review. We don't have the power to assess the Ninth Amendment as it relates to laws passed by the states. And we'll get in a little bit to maybe why they feel that way. But he was dissenting from Justice Goldberg, who claimed that the language and history of the Ninth Amendment revealed that the framers of the Constitution believed that there are additional fundamental rights protected from governmental infringement, which exist alongside those fundamental rights specifically mentioned in the first 8 constitutional amendments. And then Goldberg further claimed other fundamental personal rights should not be denied such protection or disparaged in any other way simply because they are not specifically listed in the first 8 constitutional amendments. So Justice Goldberg, in this case, this is from case of, let's just make sure I get the name right here. Griswold versus State of Connecticut. And it's a case from 1965 when when Connecticut passed some laws restricting use of birth control between married couples, or between individuals that are married. And the court struck that down. Ultimately, the court relied on due process and some other factors in the Constitution. But Goldberg is saying, look, this right's so fundamental. People are married. The government doesn't have a right to go in their bedroom and tell them what they should or shouldn't be doing. And so he says, 1, the Ninth Amendment says there are additional fundamental rights. And then 2, he claims these rights have to be treated as fundamental and important as other rights protected in the first 8 constitutional amendments. So that's one justice's opinion. That wasn't joined by a majority of the court. But then Justice Potter, who dissented and felt that the state could ban things, he then says, look, no one's ever suggested before Goldberg that the Ninth Amendment actually grants rights that exist on equal footing with the Bill of Rights. And it's an interesting place to be in looking at this to say, well, what is the Ninth Amendment talking about expressly? And if we go a little bit further, and again, this is Goldberg, he says a judicial construction that this fundamental right, so he's saying to be able to use birth control if you want, is not protected by the Constitution because it is not mentioned in explicit terms by one of the first 8 amendments or elsewhere in the Constitution would violate the 9th Amendment. So he's taking the position that, look, you can't say that the right doesn't exist because it wasn't talked about, because that makes the 9th Amendment go away. But later, in 2000, in the case of Troxell versus Granville, Justice Scalia, in a dissenting opinion, and again, not the full concurrence of the court, Justice Scalia says the 9th Amendment's refusal to deny or disparage other rights is far removed from affirming any one of them. So he says just because the government can't deny or disparage them, that doesn't mean that we as judges have to affirm them. And he says, and it's even further removed from authorizing judges to identify what they might be, or to enforce a judge's list against laws duly enacted by the people. And so and then just to throw in a couple more justices talking about, I guess one more justice talking about the 9th Amendment, some of the problems with it. Justice Black wrote, I cannot rely on the Due Process Clause or the 9th Amendment or any mysterious and uncertain natural law concept as a reason for striking down this state law. And so he's saying, look, it's just wide open. We don't have any limiting principles. We don't have any bounds that get put on an interpretation if we're going to find rights that exist. And so to date, still, the 9th Amendment sits there. And certainly judges view it as enforcing the notion that or I should say reinforcing the notion that the government has to draw its powers from the Constitution. But if the government draws its powers from the Constitution, the question then arises, how do we determine if there is a fundamental right that exists? Is it possible for the courts to not venture at all into the 9th Amendment and actually uphold the 9th Amendment? And so to give some examples of some situations, California passed a law banning homeschooling a number of years ago. And when they did, there were a lot of lawsuits about it. And before the lawsuits were finally resolved, California changed the law. And so it still allows for some homeschooling. But many people felt, hey, you're taking away this important constitutional right from me. I have a right to educate my children however I see fit. Now, education, parents, they're not mentioned in the Constitution. Children, not mentioned. So then the question becomes, if the government passes a law that says you have to attend public schools, because even in a lot of state constitutions, there's a mandate that the states provide for education. Utah, for example, says that the Utah government shall provide an open education system to those in Utah. And so the government certainly has the ability under the Constitution to regulate public education, at least. Then is there this fundamental right that says, hey, as parents, we can homeschool if we want, we can send our kids to a private school, you can't tell us where we have to go? And Michael, curious to know how you would address a question like that, or some of the thoughts you might have on it, of how would we determine if that's a fundamental right?
Yeah, it ultimately comes down to, but when determining fundamental rights, it kind of comes down to the morality of the society, what you believe to be true and good, and what you believe to be bad. The only way to objectively define it is to kind of come to the same conclusion on moral grounds, as in take a protected, something that feels like a more protected right, like the right to life. We don't feel that you should be able to just take the life of somebody else without cause. Now, it's not absolute, because we feel that you can defend yourself. And if somebody's trying to kill you, you have the right to defend yourself and maybe take somebody else's life. But as a society, we feel that it's right that you cannot just take somebody else's life arbitrarily. We feel that on a moral ground, and it's an easy one to see. We all pretty much agree on that. And so that's why there's not much of a contest there. But when it comes to something like the education of children, some people feel that maybe more of a communal right of an educated populace is more morally valuable than the right of a parent to teach their child what they feel is important. And so deciding what you feel is best kind of comes down to a moral decision. And then we say to ourselves, well, in a society like ours, how do you determine what our moral values are? How do we decide what to go with? It's going to change. If the morals of the society continue to shift, then our resolutions on these kinds of questions will continue to shift. We'll have a shifting framework of laws as we try to arbitrate between what we thought was moral before and what we think is moral today. And so, from a moral standpoint, it's a difficult question because it just kind of depends on what you believe to be morally true. But I feel that any conversation about it in a society needs to be a moral conversation. It can't be well, let's just make a law. We should be discussing what we value as a society morally, what we feel is the most important, and have talk about the consequences. If we're talking about the education of children, just look down the line and say, where does it lead if we only allow the state to educate our children? Where does it lead if we allow parents to educate their children? Have these kinds of conversations, and maybe acknowledge that some of this just cannot be arbitrated at a state level until we've decided what our moral values are as a society. One other maybe example of this, as I was reading some of these articles about rights, somebody was talking about what rights we deserve, and they were kind of taking their personal responsibility for a lot of the things they do in their life and foisting on the state, saying the state was responsible for some of these things. So, for example, they said, this is just quoting from this web page, our leaders have made a huge number of human rights commitments on our behalf. If every guarantee that they had signed up were to be met, our lives would be peaceful, secure, healthy, and comfortable. They basically just said, my own personal responsibility for creating peace, security, health, and comfort in my life, I've just foisted on the state. I think as part of these discussions about what rights we retain as a people, what rights that aren't, enumerated in the Constitution, we should maybe ask the question, how much personal responsibility are we turning over to someone else or some entity, and how much freedom can be maintained when most personal responsibility is turned over to another group? So two ways to look at it. What are our morals as a society? We need to have discussion about that. And before we can really make a decision, we need to figure out what they are. And then secondly, how much personal responsibility are we retaining? And if we retain none, how much freedom can we possibly retain?
Yeah, I think those are both good ways to look at it. And I think even to take one little step back, because I know some people will feel there's another answer. Some argue for the application of what they call natural law or universal principles that don't change. You had mentioned that morality kind of changes as a society changes. And this is one of the places where definitions become troublesome sometimes, because some people view morality as unchanging. They view what's moral as stemming from a natural or inherent good or law that exists. But I think you were talking specifically about just the morality of a nation. It's changing, just the realistic nature of our beliefs and things. Those fluctuate, and as those fluctuate and change, if we're looking as a nation to a collective morality, then our interpretations are going to change too, of the Constitution even. But that's why some people argue for looking to a more fixed point of morality, to say, as a nation, we're going to adopt a moral code. And that's the moral code we're going to live by, because it gives us a fixed basis to look to that doesn't change, regardless of how people's feelings about it change later.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I do want to make it clear. I don't believe in a shifting morality as what I believe in. I believe there is a fixed point of morality, but The funny part about that belief is there are other people that believe the same way, that there is a fixed morality that doesn't change. However, their belief in their morality is different than mine. They believe some things are right and wrong that I disagree with, and yet we both believe in a fixed point of morality. So, to your point, I believe there is a fixed point, but as humans, we don't always agree on what it is. And sometimes you'll see a society change what it believes is right and wrong, to your point. If we can arrive at a transcendent morality, something above all of us, that helps, that serves to answer a lot of these questions. The difficulty is that we haven't been able to do so, especially recently. In a lot of these cases, we don't know what we believe. Some people don't believe there is a fixed point of morality. Some people do believe that it's entirely subjective. Some people believe there's a fixed point, and even those people don't always agree with each other. So it's a difficult consensus to reach.
Yeah, and I think that understanding the reality of that lends some level of understanding as to, if you're a judge, what do you appeal to? So if someone comes in and says, hey, this law is denying me a fundamental right, it's taking something away that was left me under the Constitution, and a judge is sitting there going, who am I to go through and just pick a right? Am I throwing it at a dartboard? Is it just based on what I believe? And so, to give some respect to what the judges are saying, I think it's a very difficult place to walk into, because judges like to rely, for the most part, on the law. They do appeal to morality. They do talk about that with the compelling interest that exists, or, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. Well, there's a morality that we don't feel it's appropriate to cause this scare and panic that can kill people, and so you can get in trouble for that. But they don't usually articulate it in terms of morality as much. They try and keep in the confines of the law. And the judiciary, for the most part, hasn't gone extensively down this path of deciding public morality and what it is or isn't. And it's one of the reasons why the Ninth Amendment presents such problems for them to interpret, is that the judges have recognized, whoa, this is just going to be all over the place. And again, going back to Marbury versus Madison, if you understand that case, the only way that the courts have any power in America, and this stems from Marbury versus Madison. So again, if you want to know more about it, go to the other video on our website or on our YouTube channel that's about Marbury versus Madison specifically. But they have, the only way they have power is if the people and the branches of government give them respect. They have no ability to enforce anything they say. And the only way they can get people to do it is to be the most respected institution in the country that people follow. And because of that, they know they have to stay somewhat respectable. And if they go out venturing into a realm where there's no definitions, no boundaries, no guidelines, it really, really impacts our credibility. Because to your point, Michael, what's moral for one is not moral for others. And so if you were to ask a judge how to determine what the public morality is, kind of what's the flavor of morality in America, they most likely would say it's based on what your representatives pass. We have a representative form of government here. And they go, look, they passed the law. And so if they passed the law and it was this joint decision of all these representatives and it's the majority, that's probably the prevailing morality of the day. Which then to them, someone like Scalia says, yeah, the Ninth Amendment doesn't give us any ability to overturn something the states do because that's their morality. That's what they chose, so it can't violate a Ninth Amendment thing. If the law were so opposed to fundamental morality of the day and violated one of these rights that you say exists, they would have never passed the law. Or you're going to go vote them all out and repeal the law, one of the two. But to have us come in and, look at it from the back and say, oh, that's not right. Well, a majority of representatives felt it was right and did it. And so in a representative government, in trying to gauge, how do you gauge what public morality is? And I think that's a question where even if you have ideas, put them in the comments, other things, because it'd be very interesting to start to see what ways we have to gauge public morality on something. And a vote, a representative that has to tie their name to a vote and risk re-election, is a very interesting way to gauge public morality, what that kind of consensus is on the morality of a state. But I think that the place that breaks down, though, where the judges don't give it enough review potentially, is we live in a federalist country where states, there can be 50 different moral codes among the states. And how do you know what the prevailing morality is for America? So, for example, if California bans homeschooling and parents say, hey, this violates our 9th Amendment right, because this is a right we retain, because we retained it, you can't take it away. And they say, look, the other 49 states allow homeschooling. Is it then just a numbers game? Because California has a lot of people in it. It's got way more people than states like Wyoming, Utah, Idaho. How does that shake out exactly? Because the 9th Amendment's saying you can't take it away because I'm holding it. And in theory, that would mean federal government can't, the state government can't, because it's just retained by me. But that's again a difficult question that, again, when we're on this balance side, a lot of the rights give at least some framework. There's at least something on the law side. But this is one where it's saying, okay, law, don't go too far. Don't go too far into this morality side. Don't go too far towards tyranny, because there's other rights retained by the people. And I wanted to just go quickly through, to give you an idea maybe of some of those rights that might exist that are still strongly respected, because society does look at things a certain way. So, for example, marriage. What if the government banned marriage? Or the government said, we're going to choose who you marry? That would be a very difficult thing, again, I think, for judges to look at and wrestle with, where most would agree, whoa, they shouldn't be doing that. But how do we decide what principles are associated with that? How do we create a morality that says, yeah, government, you can't tell them who they have to marry. You can't pick that for them. But then this gets into the flip side of, well, can the government tell you how many people they can be married to? Can they restrict that? Obviously, we have people that are pushing to be able to be married to their dogs or other things. And, at some point, does the government have the ability to define marriage? Or does marriage just become something that's defined by society and changes over time? That's an interesting one. Another one is parents with respect to their children. If the government said, oh, you had a child, it's ours now. It's not yours. You don't get to raise them. You don't have rights. We just take that kid and you never see him again. And the reason I bring that up, there actually are groups that push for things like that, that want that type of system where parents don't raise kids. They're raised by professionals, trained, taught a certain way, believe a certain way. They think that helps make a perfect society, to take away the imperfections of parents. Another one would be voting. Do you have a fundamental right to vote? Is that one that just exists as part of, kind of implicit with our Constitution? To what extent can states regulate that, impact that? It's always an ongoing question. One that I look at, one that's often in debates right now, are things like, are the homeless allowed to camp? Can you restrict camping? Can you say you can't sleep here? And some of the judges are starting to come down and say, yeah, if you don't have anywhere for a homeless person to go, you can't tell them they can't sleep on the street. Now, I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but just saying that this is an issue that's producing a moral question, a moral issue in the hearts of these judges, in the hearts of other people. And they're saying, wait, if someone's homeless and they can't afford a house when houses are so crazy expensive, do we have a right to tell them they can't camp there, they can't be there? What if the government told you you're not allowed to camp at all? We're just going to ban all camping. Can't go to the mountains and camp, can't do any of that. Would that violate any of your fundamental rights? What about with things like recreation? Can the government say, we're going to ban sports? Too many people are getting hurt. Or do you have a fundamental right to choose to go out and play a game with someone and risk injury? You choose to, be involved. You might get injured. Can the government tell you no because you might get injured? Another one that's fun is, I think we're going to have more and more of these issues coming up. What rights exist as to airspace and space? We have companies now that are launching all kinds of aircraft. Amazon wants to deliver with drones. UPS wants to deliver with drones. What does that then do to us as a people? Can they fly over my yard? Do I have a right to the airspace above it? Do they have to go around it? And that even then gets into flying aircraft. Those are being developed. We have a few aircraft that are licensed in certain countries that can carry a person. It's a car, takes off, lands, can drive kind of thing. And do I have a fundamental right to be in the air if a machine exists that can take me there? Now, obviously, that's different than the government having to provide that for me. But the question becomes, can the government restrict it? Can the government say, no, this is too dangerous, this is not appropriate? To me, the realm of technology gets pretty fascinating with all that's starting to happen. And it's even here in Utah, we have a law that bans companies and government for mandating that you get a genetic test or a genetic procedure done. So for example, you can take a genetic test and see if you're predisposed to cancer. And they said, ooh, that's getting too in depth. We don't want an insurance company to be able to require someone to check, and they go, oh, you're predisposed to cancer, we don't want to take you on. Because it would disrupt the whole cancer system, or the whole insurance system, sorry, not the cancer system, the whole insurance system. And so they determined, legislatively, they determined there's kind of this fundamental right that we don't want to delve into genetics. But again, if a state didn't agree with that and they did different morality and they pushed into that and said, yeah, we want everyone to have a genetic test, where does that fall and how do these judges determine it? And so the Ninth Amendment presents a host of issues. And I think one thing to remember with the Constitution and the founders is we think about, how do we articulate these things? How do we decide what's a fundamental right? What level of regulation can exist or not exist? Because let's say that we said people had a right to flight. Well, if we say that, what about the right of people to be secure in their houses? If people are just taking off, crashing into us, or flying over us all the time, if they can video us, if they can do all those things, is there another right in conflict now? And I think, Michael, you had mentioned at one point in some of our discussions about how when you take a right to its logical extreme, can it exist without infringing on other rights? Some of these claimed rights.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea of maybe it's been talked about before. The rights, no right is absolute, because generally you can't give all of one right to an individual or a group of individuals without then restricting another right somewhere else. You just can't have 100% of everything. Just as an example, what you pointed out, right to privacy, right to airspace, right to fly my drone, right to video anything. Those are all in conflict with each other. Some people claim a right to be free from discrimination and simultaneously claim a right to communication. But if you cannot discriminate between two things, you cannot communicate. And so you can't take both of those two things to their extreme and have them live in concert with each other. So this, I think, is why there's so much division. It's somebody comes along and says this right is important, which a given right invariably is, and they want to take it to its extreme, and then it just proceeds to infringe upon a number of other rights that maybe haven't been recognized or implicitly recognized, and so there's conflict there. One thing we can probably think about as a society is, for a lot of these rights that aren't enumerated in the Constitution, we should be careful when we ask the government to arbitrate it for us, because the government is limited to enforcement. All that they can really do is come out with force and say, all right, this is the way it's going to be. And so you tend to get an extreme in a right. So if we're going to allow this right or protect this right or give this right, it's going to tend towards the extreme side, which means that other rights will be curtailed. And so if we can look as a society and try to say, okay, this isn't enumerated in the Constitution, can we find a societal solution here? What choices can we make as a society to try to balance all of these rights together? Because we can't just take one to an extreme at the expense of all the others. And I think a society can do a better job of balancing some of these rights that aren't enumerated than a government could. I'm not saying that you never take a question to the government and ask them to arbitrate. I'm saying perhaps the first place we can start on some of these is in our society and ask what we can do as members living together to try to better balance these rights, than to just go straight to the government and say, make a ruling, it's going to be extreme, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of power in that. But I think that it's actually fascinating to see that from this Ninth Amendment perspective, these rights retained by the people that weren't enumerated, there hasn't been a ton of situations where we look at in U.S. history and go, ooh, that was so crazy egregious, so far out there. Now, obviously, we look at some and say, oh, they took away your freedom of speech, or they took away your freedom of religion. But in general, we don't have these horrible rights abuses that have arisen. There has been some. I'm not saying there hasn't been any. But for the most part, the government has been checked in a representative system by the requirement that there at least be some consensus among the reps, at least, as to what's appropriate or not appropriate. And that has, I think, helped prevent a number of situations where, have they banned all camping? No, because they know that's not going to go well. There's a some kind of morality associated with the fact that people view it as healthy, appropriate, whatever, to get out and go camping. And so it hasn't been expressly banned. And morality certainly operates in the hearts of people and representatives as they look at things. And so to your question, to your point about, let's not go to the government first necessarily to arbitrate these things. Let's have the discussion as a society, I think, is a good one. But it does then still ultimately begs the question, but what if the government does go crazy and they ban something that is so fundamental that they shouldn't? And one of the ways to look at it would be to say, well, that's part of our state experiment. If one state goes crazy, let everyone move out of the state. Let them all move out and go somewhere else, and let that state fall apart if their experiment is so unjust and bad that morality is not going to allow it. Now, obviously, it's difficult. You may not always be able to afford to move out. Jobs, realistically speaking, that could be an issue. But I think even with COVID, it's been interesting. There's been a mass shift in America where people move to or from states based on their political views and even their response to COVID. And some people went to states that were very protective. Some people fled states that were very protective. And so in a federalist system, is it the end of the world if one state passes a horrible law and then you let the other states compete and say, guess what? We'll take all of your, homeschool refugees or whatever that are coming because they can't homeschool anymore. and to open their kind of boundaries up and say, we've got really friendly laws on it. Come here, we'll take you. And then let those states again compete. Let that kind of work itself out as society tries to balance what that is or isn't. Now, I'm not saying that's entirely appropriate in all situations. I could see situations still where the government may need to step in, or I should say the judiciary may need to step in and do something. But to say sometimes we want an immediate fix for something that's unjust, and sometimes we may need to have a little faith in the system and the morality of people for that to work itself out over time as people get agitated and work on it when something's so offensively unjust in their opinion.
And maybe just to offer a little more clarification, for as an example of maybe what power we have in society versus what we ask the government to do, there's a lot of laws regarding how you treat the environment. Take hiking in the woods or something. Whether you can litter, if you are pulling up trees, throwing rocks down the hill, there's a lot of regulations surrounding that. But in society, if we were able to develop a moral code that allowed us of our own will to better care for these things, there wouldn't be this number of laws regarding it. We ask for the laws because we feel that there are elements in society that are becoming very destructive. And I'm not saying we can just make that go away either. That law is necessary for sure. But sometimes if we can look around and say, what can we do to help ease these more destructive elements of society without appealing to law immediately, then we retain freedom in some of these not enumerated rights without having to seek the government to make a law. Again, when the government makes a law, it's tough to make one that balances somebody's needs on the land versus somebody's misuse of the land. But a moral society can do a really good job of that. And so that would be what I'm recommending as a beginning point. Obviously, states can overrun their boundaries. And then to your point, well, having a lot of states there is helpful because we can kind of get a good idea of where one may have done that or not. But we could probably start with the people around us and ask, are there different choices that we can make every day to try to better balance, allow the balance to remain in liberty without appealing to the government to write out laws?
Yeah, and I think I've always been interested. I go some places and they'll say, stay on the trails. And there's some places where it's very clear you want to preserve the area around. There's some beautiful stuff. You stay on the trail. And there's other places where I go, we're not going to destroy anything here if we step off the trail. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but I've been to a bunch of desert spots and things, and you just go, yeah, I'm not going to walk over the cactus. That's fine. But in general, can I go gather some rocks? Can I do whatever? And now again, there's people that will listen to that and go, oh no, everyone needs to stay on the trails all the time. But it's because people generally aren't knowledgeable about, well, what's the situation where plants recover, where things recover, or maybe even where, it's not as big a deal to have plants. One I've always been interested in is we have a very popular canyon here in Utah. And there's a beautiful set of hiking up at the top of this canyon. And there's a time in the summer when the wildflowers come out. It's just incredible. And they have the littlest parking lot up there. Super small parking lot. Only a handful of cars can park up there. And so people park along the roads and things. And then they have to come tow everyone on the roads and try and enforce that. And a lot of people call for more parking lots. And then people on the other side say, no, you're going to ruin foliage and you're going to put more people up there and things. And I look at it and go, is it the end of the world if we expanded a parking lot? And again, people say, well, you expand it, then it just fills up. You expand it, just fills up. But these are really small. And we're talking about millions of people within access. And is it really going to ruin the area to expand the parking lot and take out a few more flowers and a few more plants? I personally don't think so. I personally don't think it'd be that bad for the area to have a few more people up there. But to make it more accessible, because it is an amazing thing to see and enjoy. But to your point, if the law is mandating all those things, there's no ability to go through and say this is right for this area, but the other thing is right for this area, and have some level of education with it. So I think that is very strong point that we need to remember is, as citizens, we have to articulate principles, we have to teach, we have to expound things. And when we shirk that responsibility, we want the government just to give a fix-all solution. And those solutions are usually more extreme and they curtail liberties, because that's what law starts to do, is it moves past that balance. You get more and more laws as you move towards tyranny telling you everything. You lose the ability to decide and apply things at an appropriate level, which is problematic. But ultimately in this, I personally feel that as a country, as America, we'd be best off if we actually did the work of going through and picking, even if it's a few, moral principles that guide us as a country. And I personally believe very strongly that some serious work in this area can get us to a place where we at least agree on a few transcendent principles. And I think that our legal system, if it's to stay balanced with a liberty-based system, has to agree, or just, I guess our country has to agree on a few moral principles we live by at least, that are going to guide us as we move forward, that transcend us, that maybe we have to sacrifice some for because we don't, fully embrace it or whatnot. But I do believe very strongly that to understand our existence here, we have to understand the power that, or maybe not the power, we have to understand the need to compare one thing to another in order to understand it. So if I ask you, what's cold? What does cold mean? And you start to go through and throw out scenarios where something was cold, you can usually find a situation. So in Florida, they feel it gets cold when it gets down to 70, 60 degrees. Up in some northern places in Canada, they're out in their shorts and t-shirts at 32 degrees. And what is cold is very different based on experience there. But cold is generally the absence of heat. It's not hot, it's colder. But it's still only understood in relation to something else. And so to truly understand what's cold, we have to pick a fixed point. Then we maybe say cold, we're going to say things are truly cold once water freezes. 32 degrees generally, not counting salt water. We go through and make these definitions. When we create a point of reference, we have something that everyone can operate from, even if people disagree as to whether 32 is the correct boundary to draw for that or not. We can start to make definitions that arise out of that. And so with morality, it's certainly interesting to look back at to say, should America have a motto such as one nation under God? What is that doing for America? And to me, what that's doing is it's creating an appeal to a fixed point that transcends ourself and transcends any one human, to say we have a place that we're going to draw some level of morality from. And so we have this interesting debate even in America where a fair number of states and cities and counties have put the 10 Commandments into their courthouses. And some of them have been able to keep them in. Some of them have been struck down by the Supreme Court. And there's groups that are very opposed to that, obviously, that don't like the 10 Commandments, such as the Satanists. They don't want those up. But it provides this interesting thing when we look at least some of the commandments. Again, all 10 commandments, I don't personally believe are I don't believe we have a consensus of morality on all those, such as keeping the Sabbath day holy. That's one of the 10 Commandments. I think currently as a society, there's no consensus on that. And I don't believe there's many laws anymore related to distinguishing Sunday from other days. But we still have laws related to thou shalt not kill. That's one of the most common examples. We've held on to that morality for the most part. Obviously, it's starting to change some in some people's view, with things like euthanasia, abortion, other things. Now, people I know argue that, differently. But in general, we have a very strong opinion of thou shalt not kill. And it's still a consensus point that we go to, unless there's some type of cause. But I think from a morality perspective, to say, is it actually bad to pick a fixed point that transcends humanity, that's found in God? I personally don't believe it is, even for an atheist. To be able to say, yeah, I live in a country that draws its morality from a being I don't believe in, because they still can understand what that morality is and how things are going to be interpreted. It provides a framework that we operate within that doesn't have to ebb and flow with differences in opinions and differences in feelings. But Michael, I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on, what does it look like to define or start to come to some kind of level of agreement with morality? What are some of those things that we may need to do or consider to get to that place?
Yeah, it's a tough discussion to have. It gets to a lot of what people believe in, and people get pretty. It's easy to be defensive about what you believe, and it's easy to feel like somebody may be attacking you. But I think that we need to get down and have people, as you say, define what it is do you believe. Sometimes we just act out our beliefs without accurately defining them, so we have a hard time articulating it. I think each individual needs to kind of look inside themselves and say, what is it that I believe? What are the principles that I'm living by? How are those defined? And then we need to have discussions about that. Lots of the differences that we see politically just stem from people not discussing what they believe to be the right course of action at a very basic principle level. And so they're difficult discussions to have, but they need to be had. And it helps if we can discuss morality, as you say, as something that's transcendent, something that's above an individual, meaning what you believe can live inside yourself, but there's no reason for that to be imposed upon anybody else if your version of good and right resides only in yourself. We do like to say, when we see something that appears to us to be wrong, we have a tendency to say that shouldn't happen or that's not right. And in doing so, we're making a moral judgment that we feel other people will have sympathy towards, meaning that we think they will understand what we're feeling when we say shouldn't. What is shouldn't? It's something that's imposed upon the situation, not by me. We feel that other people would have sympathy to that as well. And so if we talk about morality as something beyond ourselves, something transcendent, then it's something that I believe we can come to a consensus on. Not that we would all agree, but we'd come to a consensus that it's something outside of ourselves, and maybe we can develop a framework of principles based on that. That it's not what I see today and what I see tomorrow. Rather, it's something that's more objectively defined around humankind throughout existence. And it's not going to change day to day. If it's just going to change day to day, then we will just be stuck in the same routines we have, where every year it's a new debate about a new law. And if that's the end of it, then that will just continue to be, and more and more laws will be created. And as we look at the balance, we'll just end up in tyranny. And perhaps that's the goal of some individuals. They feel that if they can, legislate all outcomes, then maybe they can make a better world. But I think that can be one of the principles we discuss. If we end up balanced only towards tyranny, can we end up actually with the moral outcomes that we're looking for? That's probably part of the discussion we should have.
Yeah, and it is, and that is a great thing to talk about. Well, what are the aims? Because even right now in society, one of the big aims I see creeping in is that people want the government to ensure their safety, to ensure that nothing bad happens. And it's fascinating to watch when there's this story about some child being hurt or some this or some that. Almost every one of them says, where was the government? Where are the laws? Why don't we have laws against this? And I go back to your hiking example with littering. Let's say there's a law that says no littering. Is there still litter on the trail? Absolutely, there's still litter on the trail because laws don't and can't change humans ultimately. The law is an external force that operates after the fact. And if you want to get to the place where the law operates before the fact, meaning it stops someone from littering or it stops someone from punching another person, um, you're asking the law to delve very far into realms of personal space, the brain, thoughts, all kinds of things. And if the law is supposed to stop all harm and provide this place, it's kind of like that quote you read about um, our leaders failing us because we'd have peace, we'd have security, we'd have safety, we'd have all these things. Those only exist when we become a moral people. There's no law anywhere that can make that a reality unless technology becomes such that we basically become robots, controlled. You can't think any evil, do any evil, speak any evil, and the robots stop us from doing any of those things. And then you have to ask the question, do we want to live in that kind of society? Is that what we want? Do we really want a society where there's no harm, no bad? Um, and some of us, again, it's this dream even of many Christians or others that work for Zion or various levels of utopia that exist who want to do away with all evil. But the question becomes, does mankind and technology have the ability to do that? Or is law something that's pulling us out of anarchy? Can law ever save us from all the atrocities that exist? Because we see when societies go to tyranny and the governments gain power, the exact thing the founders were trying to protect us against, which is now we're subject to whatever the laws say. They can tell us everything and anything we have to do. And during COVID, we experienced that to some extent. And it was fascinating because I don't know of anyone that was happy with the government's response to COVID. People were either upset that the government was taking away too many liberties, or they were upset that the government was still allowing people to do certain things. Um, and people that would come out and say, I have a right to be free from sickness. I just look at them and go, think about that for a minute. Do you really know what you're even saying, what you're asking? What does it entail to be free from sickness? We're humans. Sickness travels in the wind, sickness travels everywhere. If you blame a person for being the transmitter of sickness, you're completely ignoring the source that sickness originates from outside of us. It absolutely does. And it comes into us, impacts us, we deal with it. But do we want to live in a world that has that? And so far, one of the purposes of this podcast is that we're making a case for America. America is a place where we made the conscious decision to say, we don't want tyranny. We don't want anarchy. We believe that we're going to be better off, happier, more prosperous, all those things, if we balance these things. And the founders said, we don't want tyranny. We don't want the laws telling us everything because laws are not alive. Laws are a tool of power. Laws are something that people can use to control us. And in that situation, we become controlled. People lust for power. They pursue these things. The founders lived through many of the abuses that come from the law being used as a tool of power. And they said, no, And since that time, again, if you look at America, you look at it getting past its starting point, getting through the Civil War, we live in the most prosperous time and the most amazing time, the most level of innovation, all that kind of stuff that's ever taken place in the history of the world. And we sit here and go, oh, but there's injustices still. Oh, someone was hurt. Yeah, those are sad things. But does that mean we throw away everything that we have and pursue something else? And to me, these are the discussions we have to go to then say, why do we still say one nation under God? Because we're still holding on to this notion that there is a fixed something in morality that we're appealing to. And powers that be, certain people that want power, the lust for power, they're working to change that moral code. They're working to convince us that we want safety, we want security. But safety and security are an illusion. They don't come through law, they don't come through tyranny, because the only way to enforce causing harm, hurting people, arresting people, you're not safe and secure when you're being arrested because your actions don't align with what the majority wants. And that majority opinion can change at any moment, fluctuates all the time. And that's not safety and security. Law can't provide you safety and security. And so one of the things we talk about here often, which may be frustrating people, may not, I don't know, is we often say we need to have a lot more discussions about this. We need to talk about this because as a people, we have the incumbent duty to talk, to teach, to articulate, to expound, because through speaking, through interaction, this is how we experience life. This is how we learn. This is how we grow. And that process is necessary to change others or change us. Well, obviously, we're at different places right now, but we have a duty to speak to try and get us closer to the same page because that's how we progress as a society. We move more towards this middle balance to say, let's get people on the same page. And many forces work to articulate things, make arguments here and there. And we absolutely have to respond to these to say, no, this is why we stay here. This is why America is amazing. Because this is the process. This is how it works. It takes work. It takes effort. It takes sacrifice. It takes talking. It takes exchanging ideas. It takes changing opinions. And that's part of what makes America the amazing thing that it is. And so if I have a right to speak, I have a responsibility to speak. If I have a right to believe, I have a responsibility to believe because we're in a system that's balanced by law and morality. Law and responsibility are sitting here, and the two go hand in hand. When I start advocating for rights that exist without any responsibility on my part, I'm advocating for tyranny because we're saying do away with all responsibility. But we as individuals have to pursue these things. So to me, the Ninth Amendment, I would actually love to have more discussion with people and see thoughts on if there are principles that could define if there's a fundamental right that courts should recognize. For example, I actually think family might be a great argument for that, that there's certain rights associated with family, children, parents, children that could fall under the Ninth Amendment. But what's a principle to put around it? What are bounds to articulate to say what exists, what doesn't exist? And then also just to recognize that the Ninth Amendment is really talking so much about our need to be very active, to articulate our morals, to talk about our fundamental rights, to keep the government in check through our elected officials and others, that maybe the court's not the only option. Maybe we do have other options to enforce a more public morality. And again, the Ninth Amendment is certainly interesting in how it's been treated by the courts, but also kind of understandably that there's no guiding principle for them. How do they wade into this moral debate if we as a people aren't wading into it and doing our part? Michael, I don't know if you have any final thoughts before we finish for the day.
No, I think you cover that really well. We need to have these discussions. We need to talk about what is moral, and we need to talk about how our actions play into this process, how we're taking responsibilities with the rights that we've been given.
Yeah, and so we encourage you to talk to someone, start a conversation. It takes practice, it takes effort, it takes feeling uncomfortable for a little bit as you practice it and learn about it. But have a discussion, pick a topic, maybe pick a safe one. Air flight. Should there be a right to air travel? Start talking about it. Start talking about the moralities, the ins and outs, the extensions of it. Get practice with it because it's not crazy divisive topic. You can have some fun conversations and learn to talk about more and more things. But it's absolutely essential. If you want to retain rights, talk about them. Preach the morality associated with it. Teach people what it is and help move society closer to that place you believe in. Keep it there, or else those rights could go away because the judges aren't the only force that is a balancing figure of force in the Constitution. We are as well. And that's always left with us. And so keep that in mind. Keep that in mind with legislative work. Here in Utah, the legislative session's coming up in about 2 months. And as citizens, we need to be very involved in that. We need to weigh in, express the moral view, share with them what's right and wrong and why, and then let that process play out, and then continue to work on it and change things as necessary. But thanks for joining us today in A Case for America. Next week, we'll pick up on the 10th Amendment, which will have some corollary principles with it, but we'll try and focus on states' rights more because there's this fascinating balance still of, well, what rights do states have? And what can states do that the federal government can't? And are there places where they should be able to say, back off, federal government, you can't do that? So that'll be a fun discussion next week to go through. But thanks for joining us today, and we will follow up more in the next podcast.